I'm with the MIT Enterprise Forum of Cambridge. I'm the program director here, and we're so happy to have you here. I want to remind people afterwards we're going up to the 4th floor to the R&D pub for networking. And I'm not going to show you the movie. Just want to thank the Clean Tech team. This is everybody who's on the committee and has worked so hard to put the Clean Tech events together this year, and also our sponsors, Mass CEC and Pepper Hamilton, for this event. Quick reminder of upcoming things. Next week, we're doing one of our Innovation Series event, which is MIT's annual run-through of their 10 breakthrough technologies. It's always really interesting. We do a Start Smart class for entrepreneurs. One is, if you know of any would-be entrepreneurs, one's starting up Monday, May 21st. After that, virtual reality partnerships. Then blockchain technology patents versus open source, and then we cap our year with our Startup Spotlight event, which is on June 12th this year at District Hall. It's 35 or 40 startups exhibiting. It's just a lot of fun. And then I will let, who's coming up next to introduce the panel? Jen. Just hand the mic.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Jennifer Deloisio. I'm the CFO of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Sponsor, and we're really excited to be a supporter of the MIT Enterprise Forum and the Clean Tech Committee. Some of you might be familiar with Mass CEC and some of you might not. For those of you that aren't, our mission is to grow the clean energy sector in Massachusetts. And one of the ways that we do this is to drive innovation. We have a number of grant programs focused on helping companies through their different stages in their life cycle and technology evolution, including funding to help build prototypes and demonstration units, as well as getting companies their first customer. There's a number of our programs that are on our website at masscec.com, and there's a few of our colleagues that are here today, so feel free to grab us and ask us for more information. But thanks for having us. We're honored to support the work and really interested in the panel tonight, so thank you.
Great. Hey, everybody. My name is Dan Seek. For those of you who don't know me, I was the leader of this panel group in terms of pulling things together. So happy to have everybody here tonight. I think it's great to see so much turnout, and really happy to have everybody here. I just want to take a quick minute. Pepper Hamilton is one of the sponsors. I am an attorney there. We are a national law firm with 13 offices across the country. We work with companies, everything from emerging companies in a variety of fields to Fortune 100 companies. So we understand the full company life cycle and are there to help anybody who may be interested in getting something up and running. The Boston office of Pepper Hamilton has a real focus on emerging companies. That's the type of work that I do. But we are a full-service law firm with the capability to help you grow your company from really idea to commercialization to a successful exit. So, happy to be sponsoring the event today, and glad to see so many familiar faces and some new faces as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Kim Nickel. I'm a manufacturing lead at Blue Metal, which is a professional services firm. I'm happy to join you today. I'm a good friend of Jill Feblowitz's, and Jill and Vanessa and Dan are all part of the Clean Tech Committee that has made this event happen tonight, so thank you to all of you. We have a great panel here today. We have, let me get the names right. We have Danielle Joseph from Closed Loop Ventures, and I'll have them also explain a little bit about what they do and what's brought them here. We have David Leary from Jabil on the end. We have Ned Bartlett from Veolia, North America, and we also have Nicholas from Sophie's. Just to let you know, we have about an hour and 20 minutes for this panel. And I like to see that this become a conversation with all of you. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give the panel some questions for about 45 minutes, and then I'd like to open it up. So please start to think about the questions that you have for our great panel here tonight. Let me start by defining the circular economy. I think we probably have a fairly educated audience on that topic, but I just want to touch base on that. Basically, I think of it as a rethinking of the phrase reduce, reuse, and recycle to where it's a little bit more of the regenerate kind of concept applied to that. So again, the circle, let's try to make materials, okay, I'm botching that, okay. Let me just read the definition here. So the idea is that the overall system health and economic activity is driven by three principles: to design out waste and pollution, to keep products and materials in use, and to regenerate natural systems. So again, it's that system perspective, the circular element. And if you do want to find out more about the circular economy, there are two sources that I found really valuable. One is the World Economic Forum, and the other is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So with that, let's get our panel started. My first question here is for Nicholas and Danielle, really, and any of you should feel free to jump in here. Can you help explain this a little better than I did to connect the circular economy to our traditional perspective of the growth economy?
Should we introduce ourselves quickly
yes,
before? Sorry.
completely forgot.
I'm sorry.
They gave me half a beer at the cocktail hour. All right, I took the half a beer.
I'm sorry to cut you off. So I'm Nicholas Titro. I work for Sophie's. We're a Geneva-based company, consultant company. We've been working now for 10 years in sustainable development and circular economy. We have more than 500 projects under our belt in 40 countries around the world. For us, circular economy touches many themes. My personal specialization is in renewable energy and also electronic waste recycling. But we also do land planification. We do optimization of processes. And more or less what we do is co-create with our clients some solutions. Usually our clients can be either a city, a region, it can be the European government, it can be international government or the World Bank or United Nations. So we go across all kinds of spectrum.
Thank you. Danielle?
So I'm Danielle Joseph with Closed Loop Partners. We are investors in the circular economy, and so we have a few ways of doing that. One is through a debt fund that funds infrastructure for the circular economy. So we'll lend money to municipalities to help collect your recyclable materials directly from your houses. So that means lending for carts and trucks, through to material recovery facilities, or MRFs, which are the locations that sort all of your recyclable materials, and demand markets, so the folks that are taking the bales of your plastic water bottles and converting it into some kind of higher value commodity or good. And so that's one fund. And then we also have Closed Loop Ventures, which is where I'm coming from today. And we invest in early stage technologies that enable the circular economy or help to catalyze it. And we're specifically looking at sectors like textiles and apparel, food and agriculture, traditional recyclable materials and electronics, at innovations in the space that, to your point about what the definition is, reduce waste in the supply chain and help to recover the materials at the end of life and reincorporate those materials back into the supply chains where they came from.
And just to keep this acronym friendly, MRFs is?
Material Recovery Facilities.
Thank you. Ned?
Sure, Ned Bartlett from Veolia North America. Veolia is an international company based out of Paris and is really, I think, best known as an optimized resource management company focusing in water, waste, and energy. Within those spaces, there's many services or opportunities, but the water side is usually in clean water, waste is wastewater, and water recovery from industry or municipal systems. And then energy runs the gamut of district energy facilities, cogeneration plants, and then a variety of fueling stocks, so biomass facilities, waste energy facilities. Here in the United States, so the company's broken into 10 global zones. Veolia North America is comprised of Canada and the US, and really have the largest district energy portfolio on the continent, specific to the US in particular, and over about 500 megawatts annually generated here in the States. A lot in the biomass piece that perhaps we'll get to as we get into different examples in the circular economy.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And David?
Hi, all. I'm David Leary. I work with Jabil Incorporated. Jabil Incorporated is a global contract manufacturer. Traditionally, they make electronics for different companies. We have 170,000 employees. We're in over 20 nations worldwide. Where my focus is kind of the flip side of that coin, which is e-waste recycling. I'm located in Memphis, and we do chemical recycling of e-waste, bringing old electronics in and recovering the metals, specifically the precious metals from those old electronics, to put it back into new components that we produce.
Great, thank you. So this is our panel tonight, so hopefully that also gives you some ideas for you to prepare some questions. And let me come back to my first question, which is about connecting the circular economy to the traditional way of thinking about the economy. And I know that you two, we were talking about this, and this directly relates to your businesses. So Nicholas, why don't you jump in first, and then Danielle, if you'd add on.
Well, for us, the circular economy is really an optimization of everything that can be produced and consumed. We start by thinking of waste as a resource, and from that we can transform it, so that produce some chances of innovation through the transformation. And if we take, for example, the example of electronic waste, which is about a third of our business, you have to think of it as like urban mining. Like, either you go to Africa or elsewhere and you start digging and you have to refine and find the value in what you're doing, or you imagine this mine now full of cell phones and you start digging in the cell phones instead of digging in the earth. And so you can imagine that this is a much more efficient way of finding the elements you're doing. So through thinking of waste as a resource, then you can reuse to the infinite and create innovation around that value chain, and nothing ever gets thrown out. So you can think this way through everything: land planning, through water use, energy use. You can think of your neighbor that is using energy as a client for your waste energy, your steam, everything. So you have to keep it going all the time. And for us, that's a circular economy.
Right. And it's interesting to think about growth in the economy as related to the circular economy, because you are kind of flipping around the way we typically do things, which is mining for whatever precious metals and this linear progression. But if you are wrapping that stream around and making use of your waste, you're actually, in some ways, kind of creating this perpetual cycle of growth and value in the economy, which is kind of where we see ourselves being able to play and invest in the space. The other part is there's, waste as a resource is, otherwise it's literally just sitting in landfill and not being used by anyone. And so if we can capture that value and reincorporate it into the economy, there's a lot of growth potential there for jobs, and for people to reuse those materials.
And Danielle, how about to be specific in the supply chain? Because I know you've looked at the difference between the traditional supply chain and the supply chain in the circular economy. So can you expand a little more on that?
Sure. So, for example, let's take textiles. About 75 to 80 pounds of textiles are disposed of per year per household. So most homes in the United States are literally just throwing those textiles in the trash. That's cotton and polyester that is sitting in a landfill that otherwise, if it's not reused, people are then growing cotton in very labor-intensive and resource-intensive ways, or extracting oil from the ground to create those those virgin commodities. And there are companies out there, one of our portfolio companies, Evernew, is a chemical recycler that can take those cotton material wastes and reincorporate and create like kind of new virgin fibers out of that material. So that's an example of literally taking the waste stream and that would otherwise not be doing anything or potentially even harming the environment by degrading and leaving like small microfibers in the soil and bringing it back into the economy. And so that's kind of how we see it as a value creation opportunity.
And David, you've thought about it in terms of designing or defining products, and Jabil is very much thinking that way. So would you like to add some color as well?
Yes, well, you know what, I take things apart for a living. I take apart computers, I take apart cable boxes, and you take it apart and you find some that are easy to take apart and therefore easy to put back together. The components are locked in place rather than fastened in place with an adhesive or a screw. And so when you're going through that and you say, well, here's this particular brand is easily taken apart and easily put back together, and this brand is harder to do so, and it kind of clicks that if we just manufacture all items, all products to be easy to be taken apart, easy to put back together, then it's easier for us to update them as the years go on. You know, you turn in your washing machine and you get essentially the same shell of a washing machine back, but you have a few components that have been switched out, and it's more efficient.
So one of the areas I've done research in is design for X, and one is design for service. Do you think that that's good enough, or do you think it really has to be designed for disposal or designed for reuse? Is it a step further, do you think?
Well, I think there's a couple things you can do. You can either go back to the base commodity, go all the way back to, you know, whether it's a precious metal, whether it's gold, or if it's a plastic, if it's polypropylene or polyethylene. You can design your components to be taken back to that commodity and then therefore be built into anything. Or if it's something that has a little bit more value, something that can last for a 10-year period, there's some part of that technology that can last for that length of time. You can design it so it doesn't go all the way back down. It just goes back to be refurbished into something new.
Yeah, thank you. Ned, let me start with you with the next question. Where do you, given your company's focus on this issue, where do you see the growth opportunities for this market? Accenture has said that it's I think it's 4.3 trillion market or so on. So, what do you see as the biggest growth areas?
I might take that apart a little differently. I think there are many growth areas, and I think you're speaking to different scales and different markets. So we've spent a little bit of time in sort of retail because of electronics. That can scale up to be even industrial, right? There are industrial components that can be taken apart the same way and broken down. So maybe you start with the premise that if there's three general players in a circular economy, those that produce, those that purchase, a consumer role, and then companies or activities like we're discussing, entities that give them second, third, and fourth lives. That can be in the retail sector, that can be in industrial regeneration. You take oil and renew it, basically. You can take frack water and break it down. Fracking waters can be broken down into components. Salts can be taken out of it. Sulfides, you can create octane boosters to actually enhance gasoline and then take the water and rather than treat it as a waste, as Nicholas was speaking to, the water can be reused, discharged as a clean surface water under US and Canadian laws, global laws on water. It can be put back into that gas industry so it doesn't consume another natural resource. So I think the markets are really, it's limited by people's creativity, I think, as opposed to defining it as there's a particular market. These principles can be applied very broadly. And I think that speaks to maybe the customization that you do as a consultant that we try to do as innovation, the specialty that you've developed in e-waste, the investments that you cited. So I don't mean to turn the question on its head necessarily, but I think it's scalable, and I think what we're struggling with or all challenging ourselves to do globally is how do we scale it? What markets do we penetrate? Not that they're not available, it's just what innovation can we apply? What investment makes sense? To your point, some equipment breaks down easier, some equipment doesn't. So, those are barriers, but I don't think it's truly pretty limitless. And I think you're trying to replicate natural cycles. If you think about what happens with, if a tree goes through a cycle of growth, ultimately fails, falls, it decomposes to component parts again, fertilizes soil, other things grow there. I mean, it sounds very simple. we're trying to have industry and social activity for humans mimic those natural cycles, natural processes. So again, that's a theory on how you scale it.
And Danielle, how about from an investor's perspective? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think I agree with everything that just said. There are lots of markets that are open to this. There's waste being generated across pretty much every industry. So, the question of how do you scale is, targeting the right customers and the customers who are willing to pay for whatever product or service you have on the other end of it. But also what's kind of great about this industry is if you're an entrepreneur in it, there are lots of people who are willing to let you play with their waste, right? Like there's not really much risk to them to say, oh, you mean you're going to take this away from me and you're going to turn it into something great and maybe we can have a profit share, or maybe there's, maybe like I'll get paid in some way for this waste, or I just won't have to pay somebody else to take this away. Those are huge economic benefits to a lot of companies across all industries, and it makes it almost easier in some ways to be an entrepreneur. Some of the challenges to scale are getting all the right people around the table to actually create these innovations, because whether you're getting your feedstock from a company that has this waste stream and turning it into something else and selling it to somebody else, there are sometimes more players involved, and sometimes some regulation involved about how you can manage those waste streams in the case of like frack water, for example. So how do you get all those players around the table and actually build a business around it is probably the biggest barrier to scaling, but also, again, one of the greatest opportunities because there is a lot of potential.
So I do want to push a little bit more on this, because ultimately, in order to drive this good behavior and support this good behavior, we do have to fund it, right? So either through efficiency improvements or revenue or products that appeal to the market. So help me understand a little bit more, Danielle, if you're going to invest in a company that supports the circular economy, are there certain criteria that you look for? What's the quick checklist?
Sure. So we're looking for business models that will scale as any other investor would. So there has to be product market fit. You have to actually be solving a pain point for a customer. That doesn't just mean the customer who you're getting your feedstock from, but also the customer for whoever's buying your product. That customer has to be willing to pay for it. There has to be money for them to pay for it. And you have to have a really solid team in place that is ready to take the company to the next level. And between the market and the technology and the team, those are the kind of three overarching verticals that we're looking for really solid footing in, and helping to grow these businesses. And I think you had something to say.
Yeah, if I may, just building on something Danielle said, and amplified in response to your second question. I think finding your concept of partners is really important, and across industries is a place where we're finding success. So we have taken materials from manufacturers, which are coming out for them as a waste stream. Some of it we can put into a circular function on site. So a byproduct of their waste can be reused in their process again. You take a spent acid, turn it into a current and more effective acid again, or like a virgin product. Where they have excess in those materials, you can actually find other facilities. So we had someone who was in the industry of making filtration membranes. They had a spent product. They could reuse some of it. We were able to regenerate so much of it that it was more than they needed on site. We married them up to a wastewater treatment plant because that particular product could be used very well for denitrification, which was a challenge for a US-based water treatment facility. Taking out nutrients is a global priority, but a big issue under the US Clean Water Act. So that ended up being 30, 40 miles apart. But there were two customers of ours facing very different challenges. We ended up taking product from one, and it was a useful product to another. So your point about partnerships, I think, is vital. And I think you look beyond. So partly why I answered the question of I don't think it's market limited. That really came about because two people were talking inside our company that weren't on the same project. Said, I've got a denitrification problem. I said, well, I've got a product that probably do that, and I have a customer who doesn't. They've got excess. We're doing so well recycling this for them and rejuvenating it for them that they now have more than they can keep in cycle on site. So in that, it's pretty. I don't mean to be silly about it, but it's fairly organic. Again, that mirroring where would that go in products? It doesn't have to stay within the same industry.
Yeah, it speaks fairly nicely to the system perspective.
Correct.
Right? You have to redefine your system.
Yes,
Not just
and it
one
broadens
company.
beyond your own facility or your own manufacturing cycle, or it can.
Right.
And I think that is, to your point about size and scale and how you get it to take hold across sectors. I think that's some of the opportunity, some of the challenge, but a lot of the opportunity.
If I can add to this a little bit about the scaling up of solution, there's quite a bit of work that we do on industrial parks that we try to
Sure.
rename now
Yeah.
eco-industrial parks, where you go and some of them can have 200 or 300 industries, all different. They're shipping things in and out. There's already some infrastructure for waste, but nobody really understands it. And one of the first things that you have to do is understand exactly what everybody uses and what comes out.
Right.
And what infrastructure is there. And then bringing everybody to the table is one of the biggest challenge that you can have, because everybody speaks a different language. The only language that everybody speaks of is profit. And you have to be pragmatic.
It's true.
You have to be pragmatic and bringing everybody there, you say, okay, everybody is interested in profits. We're going to keep that in, and we're going to improve on it. And we're going to improve by exchanging this currency that has a value. It can be the steam from someone. It can be the wastewater from someone. It can be calcium from someone. It can be waste from agro waste. But everybody can reuse it, and it's one of the biggest challenge to this scaling up, because if you go one-to-one, then it's okay. It's organic growth, but it's very slow. If you go at the eco-industrial park scale, then you can go a bit faster, and then you can start to connect all these eco-industrial parks together, because they will have bulk waste. Because often in those industrial parks, you're going to have also industrial partners that have fairly close value chains, and so they have, at some point they may have an excess of some waste that another industrial park is interested in, and I think in Europe now that we're at that point where we're trying to connect
Right.
very high density industrial parks to keep them competitive. And I think that's one way to scale up, but it's that bringing everybody that speaks a different language at the table that is really the
It's a-
challenge.
And
Yeah, please go ahead.
And I think it's interesting to think about, so the industrial park example is amazing for large corporations. I think you can also think about ecosystems on a household level. Like, one of our investments is in a small scale anaerobic digester system. So you put your food waste into the digester, and it produces energy that you can use for your stove and fertilizer that you can use for your fields. So if you think about, the ecosystem on a large scale or ecosystem on a small scale, like, what are all the things that I need in my home, and how does one system that enables a circular economy service a lot of those needs?
And I want to
Absolutely.
get David's perspective too, because this is, one company has, processing its own waste to some extent. So how does Jabil justify the, the investment internally to do the
Well,
kind of work you do?
Yeah, and just to go on with what everyone else is saying, is that there are circles everywhere that need to be closed, and it goes on all scales, and specifically in a startup environment. There's such a global manufacturing environment out there, but there are opportunities at every level, in the neighborhood, in the community, at the state. Waste, like Ned was saying, waste is everywhere. Space can be wasted. Offices are only used 50% of the time. How can we tap into that resource? For Jabil and for us, it's e-waste, where lithium-ion batteries, plastic. Like I said, we manufacture components for people. So anywhere that we can recover those resources, go back to those commodities. Now we have a source readily available for us to manufacture new components for people. E-waste and the mining industry is an example where already the diminishing returns of the mining industry makes it less efficient than recycling those metals, recovering those metals from anything in the world or in the environment. And as we develop new technologies and as we find ways to recover these wastes, it'll be the same for across the spectrum. It won't just be metals, it'll be plastics, it'll be food, it'll be space, it'll be transportation. As we develop this technology, we'll find that the value retained by resource recovery in the circular economy enables you to have that much more disposable income.
And I'm going to
cash
put you on
flow.
the spot. I'm going to put you on the spot. So is your group a profit center for the company? Or is Jabil basically looking at it as a process that eventually will be a profit center?
So it's a service that we provide. If we work with a certain manufacturer, Danielle said that people will let you play with their waste. A lot of times people are worried about where their waste ends up. And so we provide a service to manufacturers. Anything that comes in our door, if they want it to be an end-of-life product, it is an end-of-life product. And so Jabil is not only able to recover resources for our manufacturing, but also we're able to provide services for companies that want to make sure that their material is handled responsibly and efficiently.
Another take on that is, so Closed Loop Fund, the debt infrastructure fund, is funded by major corporate LPs, so Unilever, Coke, Pepsi, Johnson & Johnson, Walmart. And they've invested in that fund to help build out recycling infrastructure in the US because they see their supply chains as partially as a risk, right? If you're reliant on mining and oil and like kind of volatile commodities, how do you secure your supply chain? So to your question, it's not necessarily an immediate term kind of solution for them, but in the long term, they see the value of having these recyclable materials incorporated into their supply chains as a form of risk reduction, as a form of environmental benefit, and that's that kind of holistic approach as well.
And even building on that same concept, supply chain resilience. Some of these resources, as you said, the volatility now, if you can close loop or come close to a closed loop, you have more predictable supply back in your own industry or to a complementary industry, to your point about co-location. Just saw a project in South Carolina where there's actually industries taking up about a 400-acre site and co-locating intentionally because they have complementary either supply chain or design cycle, and they're cutting down on the transportation cost by being close together. It helps their sustainability goals by getting out of trucking, to be very simple about it. They're really cutting down on CO2, CO2e by just cutting out that the co-location value of dropping transportation. And they even are locating now near rail facilities. We have folks who are doing that in the Canada-US border. They're intentionally getting near rail to cut down on trucking and transportation costs and supply issues. So you do see some synergies come together like that that are pretty impressive.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk more about technology and the potential for startups or for existing companies to develop new technology to make this, to justify it from a financial perspective. Who would like to start first to share a little bit about if there's a technology that you think has really made this process more cost efficient or easier to scale? Let me know.
Well, I think I have a lot of examples. The problem with circular economy examples is that they're so complicated sometimes that it's very difficult to go into a few minutes into all the details because the value chain becomes so complex. But for example, one of the startups that we worked with on one of these eco-industrial park where a lot of pharma companies were concentrated, decided that, and it's one of the concepts of circular economy is that you start sharing instead of owning. And then they started to design a refinement plant where they owned all the solvents that were used on the eco-industrial park. So instead of having all the companies buying their own water, buying their own methanol, ethanol, propanol, all of their solvents, they were renting them. And so you use them, it becomes a waste, and then it goes back to the company that cleans it up, and then it's a closed loop. So you have to start to understand the system to find where the innovation is possible. Another example that you just mentioned was on offices that are 50% empty all the time. And one spin-off from Sophie's is Airbnb for co-working space. So that's a pure technology answer to a real problem, and we find that companies now decide that instead of building larger infrastructure for their employees, they either keep them at home or pay them to go into a co-working system. And the app is just like Airbnb. You're like, who's there? I like that person. He has complementary ideas to me. I've wanted to meet people from this industry for a while. He's in this co-working. I see it, and then I go, and through blockchain, everything is paid automatically. So there are ways to definitely to find innovation in this circular economy.
Yeah, and I think that there's lots of room for innovative technologies, and you can speak more to the chemical recycling side of things, but that's one exciting piece of this. There's also really simple business model innovations that are really exciting. So one of our other portfolio companies is the Renewal Workshop, and when major brands think anyone who you buy your clothing from, it could be Prana, it could be whatever, J. Crew, they pull in all of their finished apparel from overseas. And when it gets here, if it's missing a button or the zipper's broken or something's not the right color exactly, it gets landfilled or incinerated. And so the Renewal Workshop takes all of that material, Prana is actually an example, and they will refurbish it. So they have a facility and they have some seamstresses, and they put on that new zipper or sew that pocket on or that button on, and then that product is good as new and able to be resold again, either through the brand that initially brought it into the country or through the Renewal Workshop. And not complicated, but it's a innovative business model that is enabling that kind of circularity.
David, any technology you'd like to click your fingers and snap your fingers and instantly have?
Yes, particularly in the U.S., we a lot of times have single or just a couple waste streams. I was talking with Philippe from Switzerland earlier, and he was mentioning that that they have 7 different bins, 7 different places that they put their plastics and their cardboard and their paper, and I think that if I could develop anything, it would be something that does an optical sort for the waste stream. Because if I get 100 pounds or 1,000 pounds of waste coming through my door, maybe 5 or 6 of those pounds really has value. And so the ability to single that out, the ability to capture that from everything else, and then get the recovery of that would be great.
That would definitely help you scale, right?
It would be great to have, absolutely it
Yeah.
would. And then that's also a little bit of a cultural change, though, that we can kind of foster, which is that if people are more apt to, maybe in your recycling bin, there's paper and then there's also electronics. And then it's pre-separated for you, it's pre-segregated. I think that those are both places that technology can be developed and processes that can be developed that increase the efficiency of the circular economy.
I've got some optical sorts for you.
All
I was
right.
just going to say, there's a really good outfit starting up in Austin, Texas, that's doing hazardous waste segregation, in part just visual on the product, but also putting barcode scans into it. So they're pulling by barcode off of certain products, as well as then visual scans for those that don't have intact labels. Or it's remarkable. And then tied to robotic arm, they'll pull the material. It's great. It's a really great technology.
Yeah. And there's the other part of the waste industry is that it's not, or at least the recycling industry in the United States is not super technical, right? A lot of lines are, you have all of your recyclable, papers and bottles, and they get thrown onto a conveyor belt, and then there are people that are literally hand sorting them. So if you think about an industry that's really ripe for innovation, this is one of them. So to your point, an optical sort, one of our other portfolio companies is Amp Robotics. That is that arm with an intelligent visioning system. So it can read through and say, okay, Dasani water bottle here, Coke can there. And it's a huge economic benefit both to the material recovery facility and can potentially create even cleaner bales, which is a problem in the recycling industry that we can get to later.
Maybe I'd like to build on this example because we, especially for electronic waste in Europe, the extended producer responsibility concept, where the producer is responsible from selling the product all the way to its end of life, and it's funded often through when you buy the product. the whole end of life value chain is funded through that. So one of the pillar of circular economy in Europe is also social progress. And this is a bit more difficult because now we're not talking about profits. We're talking about profit as a society as a whole. And it's a new concept that's been added, I would say, in the last decade, probably in Europe. And electronic waste is one of the test bed for reintroducing people to the workforce through sorting, learning how to dismantle electronic material, what is hazardous, what is not, what do you do, how do you take decisions. And a lot of the electronic waste recycling system nowadays in Europe is more manual than it used to be. Because it's used now as a job program. And one of the good thing about that is that a lot of jobs actually in the circular economy are very local jobs. They're very difficult to relocate and send abroad. And it's one of the big pillar in Europe of that circular economy is how do we bring social progress through circularity, and now it's one of the test bed for. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have sorting. We do as well, especially for very hazardous waste. But we have to. I think we have to integrate profits. We have to integrate environment in there. We haven't really talked about the environment so much so far, but also now we have to think about social progress as well.
So let's stay on the people topic. One of the things we were talking a little bit about last week was how do we make this easier for the public to basically go along with this concept, and also, Ned, given your background, if you would comment from a regulatory perspective, or even you can talk about consumers too. But
sure.
Yeah, start us off there.
Well, I think there's been an evolution there. I mean,
Ned, explain your background, why I made that
reference. Fair enough. Yeah. I have been in and out of public sector life and private sector life for much of my career. So started with the Weld Salucci administration here in the late mid-90s, governor for the state. Went into private legal practice in largely an industrial compliance role, environmental permitting role, transportation infrastructure jobs. And then most recently served as the Undersecretary for Energy and Environmental Affairs for Governor Baker here in Massachusetts again. So in that, I have seen, I guess, perhaps both sides of the table on how regulatory interacts with private, and then what private might ask back of government in some regard. So is that sufficient, I guess?
That's good.
Okay.
That will do. Thank you.
I'm not much on the bio stuff. I apologize. It's not my strong speaking suit. But in that background, I think we've seen an evolution in the field, right? From unregulated entirely, looking mainly at the U.S., so the rise of a social consciousness that then led to regulation, a command and control regulatory scheme that then led to penalty and consequence. So it created a market by a compliance obligation. Your example of now a more gentle version of that is an extended liability for a product you produce, seeing it not necessarily cradle to grave, but its ultimate control. Mm-hmm. Cradle to grave for hazardous waste is very effective, but also can be limiting in terms of the grave end. We're trying to get away from that linear to, again, circular. And then I think the existence of one of our sponsors is a great example in the Mass CEC. You see a rise of government as really an effort to unlock investment and innovation and to be a part incubating that and investing in it. So sorry for a shameless plug for Mass government, but I think the CEC does a great job at that. I think it speaks to an evolving role of government from going from regulator to going to perhaps more partnership or incentive-based. I think, if I may, and if you guys will indulge me on a clean energy piece, you see that here, you see it in New York, California, North Carolina. We've just done a conversion of a power plant in Lumberton, North Carolina, 25 megawatt coal plant turned to biomass. They have problems with chicken litter, to be perfectly honest, concentrated feed lots. And you take chicken litter with woody biomass or wood waste, you blend the two in that facility, you're now putting out 25 megawatts of pretty clean energy. Co-benefits or the circular elements are you're tackling a really noxious pollution form. Chicken litter may sound relatively harmless, but the nitrates, nitrides, phosphates, the clean water impacts are really pretty egregious. hard waste to manage. The biologics can be hard to manage. Incinerating them, as opposed to land application, manages on the water side. Took over 11,000 vehicles off the road, trucks of that waste material, so its a CO2 equivalent is really quite strong. And then the output is actually a really heavily concentrated and more benign fertilizer, but really targeted fertilizer use that can be sold and applied as opposed to a runoff context or runoff management from feedlot operation. And that is in part enabled by a good waste energy policy or clean energy programs that looks at biomass and looks at chicken litter. You see piggeries turning to biogases, for example. There's similar programs in other states. That's really government on the incent side. But there's a heavy compliance side for the clean water side on the waste. If it's not properly managed, you have Clean Water Act violations associated to the industry that's raising and in poultry. And to your point about agribusiness throughout the country, it's a better, more sustainable practice. People routinely poll pretty well on seeing, oddly in this country, the debate over free range versus caged chickens has become remarkable in the last 3 years. And how they manage waste off those industries and people's sensitivity towards it has been, pretty well documented. It's become a voting issue. I think Pew had it identified as on a ballot initiative in 17 states as to how chickens are handled. And it's remarkable, right? 20 years ago, there was not even really a question in the agriculture industry in the country. So again, there's elements like that you see take off on the government to incent side. And I think the market side, again, it's unlocking innovation and investment. I think you're seeing less command and control approach. So.
And David, is there a consumer message from your organization that you share with your customers, perhaps?
Well, and then I do think that it's kind of what we've been talking about up here, which is just that that everything, all waste can be a resource, and I think you need to bring that awareness to the consumer, to everyone, that any waste is an environmental hazard. And to think of it in that context, and then also, here we are learning that the chicken litter can be turned into energy, right? So anything literally can be the products of tomorrow. For consumers, from our standpoint, it feels good to know that your old phone is now your new phone. And you feel like you're doing your part, and certainly the manufacturer is going to get a lot of benefit from taking their old equipment back in and turning it into something new.
So I said that I would open it up to the audience. Let me ask one more question, and then it's your turn. So roadblocks, challenges, lessons learned, any guidance that you can give people in the room in order to help share this message for the circular economy and help it scale. Nicholas?
Well, I think information is we haven't really touched this subject yet. I think informing people in all kinds of walk of life about the impact of their waste and pollution and how it can impact community is important. And for that, you need to create indicators that people can understand. And I think it's one of the key issue in trying to communicate about circular economy is how will people internalize this information? How will they understand? Because if we're talking about government regulation, you need to have people concerned about it, asking about changes, and for that they need to have some indicator. And I think things like the Energy Star system has changed a lot on how people think about energy use, and I think we need to have more voluntary schemes like this where people are really the driving force for that change.
I used to work for UL. You think there should be essentially a UL stamp, UL certified, it has X% recycled material, something like that?
Well, I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, now we're working on a voluntary scheme for electronic waste, for example, because it's one of the big failure, at least in Europe, of that extended producer responsibility is that there's a tax that is added to everything electronic you buy, and that tax is supposed to be commensurate on how difficult the material is to be recycled. and the idea behind is that the producers won't want their instruments to be taxed a lot because they will lose competitiveness, and then they will design their product in such a way that it's going to be easier to recycle, and that's a big failure. Nobody has done it. And then so you have to say, okay, so how am I going to communicate to the consumer when he's at the store and he's got 7 phones in front of him that one of them is better than the other ones? And it has to be easy to understand and instantaneous. And so that the consumer actually is the driving force and not government regulation or taxes or anything. It's choose when you buy the product that fits your values, and I think that's one of the most important changes.
Thank you. Danielle?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit, but there are so many different players that can touch any one business in the circular economy. So really knowing who the most important ones are for you to communicate with and have a relationship with as you're starting a business is really important. And then also really understanding the kind of value that you're creating for each player in the space. Because as we all, I think, mentioned, there are a lot of benefits to a lot of different players. And in order to bring everyone to the table together, you have to be able to share the information and the value in a way that's relatable to everyone, from the product designer to the MRF operator. And so making sure that you have a clear understanding of what those values are and to which players before you start a company is probably the biggest challenge that I've seen in early stage companies that we've funded and for folks in the space.
Thank you. Ned?
I think just building on that concept of interconnectedness across businesses. I think some of the early stages that we've seen of is people look inside their own industry and say, well, how do I recoup this or keep a circular concept within a facility, within a type of industry? I think the opportunities across industries is quite large, and you see that, again, your concept of eco-industrial parks, or even just business partnerships that align, and the ability to move materials in that direction. The second is information about waste, rethinking how you look at waste streams. Industries are doing that pretty well within themselves. I don't know that in a commercial economy, more retail sale, as you said, that information is not as penetrable. And so whether it's your UL rating listing or modeling LEED on office space and built space. So the LEED system, I think, brought forward a concept, and now it's really almost hard for a company to go forward and not build at a LEED Gold or Platinum level for a building. It's really become nearly unacceptable behavior. Whether that's the right system and whether it should be LEED or other standards now, there are competing standards. I'll set that aside for maybe a different panel's efforts, but that concept applied here might really help move information, as you say, at a level that people can digest it very readily by seeing that marker on a product or in a sector.
Great. David?
I would say if you can't find that partner, which ideally you can't find that partner, but if you can't, there's going to be a lot of development into reverse logistics that has to take place. And also, a lot of times you have to go through a very large amount of product to get a small amount of value. And so the ability to process tons and tons of material can require significant capital investment to be able to do so. And that can definitely be a barrier to entry.
Great. So what we're going to do now is there's a microphone for questions. Does anyone know where that microphone is? There's no microphone for questions. Okay. So we are recording the session and streaming it. So if you ask a question, I'm going to repeat it just to make sure it's recorded. So do we have any questions from the group? All right. So let's see. I'm going to go with the first hand in the second row here, if you would.
Hi, Alistair Penn. So you talked about states being a good vehicle, or countries of sort of setting the tone of what would be like policies, but incentives or ideas for how to recycle. But what about the role of cities? We're starting to see Boston talk about recycling here, but is that common in Europe? And how do you compare what's going on in Europe and the US in that front?
So basically the question's about smart cities and cities playing a role in the circular economy.
Well, let's take the example of Switzerland because it's the closest one to me. The cities now, they valorize the waste. Let's put it that way. So if they can sort it and then sell it to recyclers, they will. Whatever is left, they will burn it, and they will take the heat from that burning through having loops of water through all the cities. Every building is connected to that loop of water, and heating now in the winter is through incineration. And nowadays they will even take the ash and valorize the minerals that are in it. So yes, the cities now, and that's only for solid waste, because they will do the same for water as well. When they do water treatment, the sediments from the water treatment is biodigested to create gas that is reused internally for the waste recycling. And now we can also take the ammonium out of the wastewater that comes from this biodigestion. So everything is slowly becoming very optimized, and that's why cities are our biggest clients, because they need to close all the loops on their waste because they cannot landfill it anymore. It's illegal.
Ned, do you want to add a vision there?
Sure. I mean, I think the answer is simply yes. There's a role for municipalities. I think globally, liken it maybe to the subnational movement around climate change issues, right? National leadership is great. State leadership is common in the U.S., certainly Canadian provinces. But federal schemes or international schemes, I think, help with scale and size. But having a municipal role, absolutely. I mean, the innovation will come where it comes. I think some of the challenges you see, you're familiar with, Alistair, from NECC's work, in that when you have to do it municipality by municipality, certainly at least in the States, having vendors pick up those contracts, what it supports in their side. You know, if we run into that challenge in the Northeast on basically anaerobic digestion, waste diversion from landfill, that market hasn't quite gone maybe as everyone's predicted. That doesn't mean that the waste ban and waste diversion is wrong. People underestimated the slurrying of it into a feedstock, so that's got to be adjusted for now. So yeah, I think there's a sort of trial and error process that will make municipal leadership really valuable, because they can be pilots in a way, and they provide some basis to try and get scale.
Thank you. I think the gentleman behind you, and then we'll come up to you, sir.
So, talked about externalities, and I guess externalities can be more or less applicable depending on the recycling stream, et cetera. So we just heard Scott Pruitt is going to try to discount or co-benefits, human health, et cetera, aspects in terms of environmental regulations. So there may be some very strong swings in regulation. I wonder if you can comment on policy risk in terms of your own companies or portfolio companies or clients, and how it does or does not apply to different kinds of recycling operations.
So the question's about risk and the association with different kinds of recycling, if it impacts them and favors one over another.
Policy risk, yeah.
Yep. No takers. It's a delicate subject there.
Well,
I'm not sure how
maybe I can
political we're
try.
going to get.
Maybe I can try
Let's let
something.
the European take the political.
Yeah, I'm
Take the first
Canadian,
shot.
by the way. I'm not. Even though I'm representing
worse.
Europe today, yeah, I'm a sellout. For a lot of policies now in Europe, at least the ones that would have very strong impacts, are dealt with through R&D funding nowadays, where they will fund think tanks for a while, for a few years, to produce a body of work that would describe well what's going to happen if policies go either way. And they will have multiple groups like this that will compete for funding, and a few of them will be funded, and policies are trialed in pilot projects, and it's a very slow and costly way of doing it, but it's a more predictable way of doing it.
From our investment side, we don't invest in markets that are driven by policy, definitely not at the federal level. You've seen a lot of markets fail for one reason or another, whether the administration changes or the enforcement of whatever policy that's on the books doesn't actually get implemented. So that's a huge risk area that we try to avoid as investors. And I think to the earlier question of what role cities have to play in this, there are much more effective local policies that are typically a little bit more stable that drive, I think, the circular economy, because it is they typically are local solutions to local problems. And so the way that we work with public administrations is typically on, at least on the closed loop fund side, not on the venture investing side, is with local municipalities that might own the MRF or that might be running the collection of recyclable materials. And when you have that direct relationship with the municipality and you're lending directly to them, that's a more stable kind of way of interacting. And I think to kind of your point of like the industrial parks, if you're integrating the municipality into the solutions for the private operators, and there's a more long-term benefit that you can see that's not dependent on what Scott Pruitt is doing.
But I think you bring a really good point. Predictability is extremely important for investment. I think in policies for sure. Everything needs to be predictable for at least 10 years to be able to fund something tangible.
Thank you.
I'll take a nibble at the EPA question.
Okay.
Maybe putting the private lawyer hat back on and attributing it to that part of my career, because I don't know that your point about markets and predictability, I think it's really important to unwind that which is policy, as you described, and that which is regulatory, and that which is statutory. So sorry to put the legal hat on there, but unwinding that is really, really important. And I think you can find some great material online from the former EPA administrator, Gina McCarthy, who's certainly a hometown favorite here in Massachusetts, that there is a record, there is a status of law, and to unwind human health from EPA gets to a statutory and regulatory question, not merely a policy question. So it's one thing to say you're doing it. It'll be interesting to see if by the time you're done tangling with the judiciary and the legislature, whether you'll be able to do it. At least in this country. There are places where that may be easier to do as a policy edict. But in the US, I think there's a long road to disassemble human health as part of protecting the environment in the US. It's not to say it's impenetrable, but it's a very long road. So I'm not too fearful of its market impact yet.
Thank you.
Sure.
And up front?
Yes, I've been kind of looking for interesting recycling technologies, visiting various companies, and the impression I have is, geez, I wish I could come back in 3 years, or I wish I could come back in 5 years. This is going to be a great world at that point. But and especially in those areas involving chemistry. The robotics I can understand, that technology is kind of ready. But I was just curious if you have any perspectives on, where, I think it was partially addressed, but, frankly, I haven't seen that many commercially ready recycling technologies apart from the robotics area. Am I looking in the wrong places?
So just so I understand your question, so are you asking, is there a technology that's on the cusp right now that is going to become mainstream in the short term? Is that a fair way to say it?
That's
Yeah,
right.
because I think part of what you're saying is that you think there are a lot of technologies
I
that
think there are
probably
a lot of
5 years.
technologies in 3 to 5 years are going to
Right.
be very interesting.
But
Right.
what's interesting
But
now?
I haven't seen anything yet, and by no means am I going to say, do I know everything? I've only looked at a very small sample. That I haven't seen a lot of companies, let's say, that I say, in 12 months they're going to be.
Got it. So
Yeah.
the shorter term. Any thoughts on technology that you think is really going to escalate quickly?
Yeah, so I think the reason why chemistry hasn't come around so quickly is that in metal recovery, there has been chemical recovery of metals for years, but it uses aggressive acids that are very dangerous to people in the environment. But as we work at it more and do more in R&D, we find ways that we can do it in a less aggressive manner, at least to humans, that still dissolve the metals. And that's what Jabil is working on, and a process that we've developed. That and then also, as we continue to grow our recycling methods, we figure out ways to make it more and more efficient. And I think that eventually you have to get away from physical sorting and bring it down to the molecular level. For example, I go back to polyethylene and polypropylene. You can't, as of now, you can't really combine those two streams and do a recycling process, but you can manipulate it chemically to the point where they become a new plastic. And I think that this development of the circular economy will innovate more down that path.
And I think that that's right. The chemical recycling is probably what we're going to see more and more of in the future. I think also, to your point earlier, one of the biggest barriers to that is the appropriate funding mechanisms for it, right? So they are capital intensive. They require deep partnerships with industrials that can build these at scale. And right now, I think it's hard for a lot of those very early stage companies that might have developed the technology and are ready to scale it to find those capital sources.
If I might just ask a clarifying question, are you talking recovery of chemicals or chemical process as a way of recycling? A comment I would offer there is I think a lot of it's occurring, actually, but there are sensitivities around it such that the industries that do it aren't necessarily marketing or making much noise about it. So I think there's actually a decent amount of chemical process used for materials recovery. But much like the nuclear debate on energy, people have strong opinions about using chemical process. So I think it's easier to talk about design, supply chain, business models as opposed to maybe chemical recovery. But I think there are models that are occurring, and actually at the industrial scale pretty successfully. I don't know in the startup market, I'd leave that to Danielle, but designing solutions that include chemical processes, I think they're in play now and becoming larger in scale, and probably with successes, maybe there'll be more case studies and conversations about them. But I think it does draw ancillary concerns using chemical process.
In those situations, that's being driven by your company or by chemical companies?
Across the spectrum. I think chemical companies are doing it for themselves. I think they're outsourcing probably to any number of companies. Designing systems like that, absolutely. I mean, that's part of it is, I would say, maybe that begs a different question, which is I think a lot of circular economy work is also customized solutions right now. I don't think a lot of this is off the shelf yet. I think in some markets, you guys are trying to make electronics, not just your company, but electronics, we're trying to make that systematic and more uniform to have designed products that are easier to break down. But for industrial processes, I think it's a lot of customized solutions. And I think in that, whether it's consulting services out of some of the teams, startups that are doing it, companies like ourselves that are working with an existing client, they come to with us a new problem. We've set up labs on five different countries to design environmental service solutions in a circular economy. The whole exclusive purpose of those 5 labs, Germany, France, Australia, UK, US, is to try and develop systems out of the customized solutions that we've built for one-off client situations, right? So, we absolutely have gone to an R&D scale around trying to make them systematic, but right now, I think there's a lot of customized work that does include chemical process for recovery.
Right. And I think that to the point of there are customized solutions right now, whether you're in the textile industry or the whatever bottle
E-waste,
recycling or e-waste industry. And I don't think that there needs to be one unifying chemical recycling technology that's going to win the market. I think that these are huge markets in and of themselves, and you can see winners and multiple winners even within textile recovery alone or within probably electronics recovery alone.
2 years ago, not through Veolia, when I was working for the Commonwealth, there was a project here at MIT where in wastewater technologies, they were actually using acoustic wave to create precipitates in the water stream. So it's a physical process, right? But they're creating a precipitate. Is it chemistry? Was it physical process because it was sound wave? I don't know. I'd leave that to the professors and their brilliant students who figured out how to do it. If they can scale that, can you imagine using acoustics in wastewater as a way to take out certain byproduct or product? Remarkable. be really cost effective, fairly simple. So, I think not everything is on the table in terms of processes, and I think again chemical is in the mix as well.
Let's take a new question from the back there. Yeah, if you.
At the beginning of your conversation, I was so interested to hear you talk about recycling as providing some security to the supply chain. But I got to thinking about, well, what about an industry like retail, and maybe not phones, but other products in which maybe the supply chain doesn't feel particularly threatened? An example that you could perhaps talk through, or maybe you choose a different example. Amazon is using thousands upon thousands of cardboard boxes, and I don't know if they use recycled cardboard, but if they don't, then what would be the incentive to have them do that, so they create demand, so they generate supply? You're talking about some closed municipalities. If you'd like that example, how on a bigger national kind of scale, how would that fit into some of your thinking?
Sure.
So if I can start there. So the question was about how do we motivate different kinds of supply chains where security isn't an issue to pursue the circular economy? And if I can just give an example, I'm a town meeting member in my town, and last night we had our first night till 11 o'clock. And one of the issues was the cost of the recycling and the fact that it's gone up for the town and it's no longer a profit center for the town. The only stream that is still profitable is actually the corrugated cardboard. So there's still a demand for that, but corrugated cardboard is actually one of the better and easier to recycle. So I'll hand it over to the panel to comment
Please,
some more.
Danielle.
So part of this is, the first caveat is the long-term vision of the company, right? So if you're looking at, let's take paper recycling broadly, right? Paper comes from pulp, which comes from trees, right? So you're cutting down forests to make this paper product. Depending on where you are, those forests may be more or less available. If we look at a lot of forests today, there's a lot of unsustainable harvesting that's been going on. So paper's an interesting example because we're not actually using a lot of paper right now, but there is a lot of concern over, like, where is our paper coming from? Where are we sustainably harvesting from? How do we create these kind of stable papers that can go into our cardboard boxes? And as our demand is increasing, how do we match that with a sustainable supply? So I think Amazon and the folks that are shipping a lot in cardboard boxes are looking at that supply chain as, if there's a major forest fire in the location where they're getting a bunch of their paper supply from, how do they protect against that, right? And the recycling industry is a good way to do that. And I think you see the same thing in plastics of, if there's a problem in the supply chain, if there's a geopolitical issue in Venezuela and oil prices spike, how do we protect against those rising prices in our supply chain? And I think a good corollary to that is actually in the energy industry, where you saw companies moving in pretty large ways against that volatility. And I think you can see the same thing here.
I think motivation-wise, we see financial, regulatory, which it's hard to call that motivation, but still it's a form.
It's motivating.
Yeah. The brand of the company, so how sustainable they want to be, and then the other is the consumer or the customer. If the customer is not an end consumer like you or me, if it happens to be a business, then it's the customer-driven type of investment. Is that a fair assessment?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was going to say that all waste still has a value, and if you landfill that waste, you lose that value. However, if you're able to recycle that waste, then you can recover some of what the material still retains. Once I cut down a tree, that cost is sunk. I would rather turn the product that that tree was turned into back into itself, back into a new product, so that I don't lose that value over the course of the life of that product. Another way to think of it is that I'm sorry, I just lost it.
Well, I would think of it that way, but I don't know if Amazon thinks of it that way.
Most of the retail brands, I can tell you that most of the retail brands want their consumers and their customers to not have a reason to stop buying from them. And so they do make considerations related to sustainability, not necessarily the circular economy, but environmental sustainability is certainly a factor, and it's about supporting the power of their brand and making sure there's nothing that will damage their brand. So I am pretty sure that they're thinking about it for that reason. Yeah. A question up front?
Actually, very related to what you were just talking about was for the electronics recycler, I don't know who it was, I forgot, but the guy in Southern California who's an electronics recycler recently basically found a way to extend the life, for better terms, of a Microsoft computer and was sued to the ground and is now sentenced to 15 months of prison time as a guy that just extended the life. Wasn't even selling software, wasn't just... Anyways, point is, how do you handle that, particularly in the startup world, is that if you extend the life of anything, if you do anything with anything, you run the risk that some company's come and said, no, because I want people buying the new one, right? And you're hurting their sales, and they can always make that argument, oh, you're hurting my sales.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so let
how do
me
you
just
handle the consumer
paraphrase.
side?
So it's essentially companies depend on products having an end of life to encourage you to buy a new one.
Yep.
How do we make sure that you're not damaging that new revenue?
Yeah. Well, part of it is working directly with the companies that you're extending the life of the product for. So in the case of the renewal workshop, they have a direct relationship. In the case of this guy in Southern California, I think one of the issues was that he was manufacturing CDs that looked a lot like the CDs that Microsoft was trying to sell its customers. And
They function differently, but yeah.
right. And so I think part of it is, again, knowing who are the right people who you need to connect to in order to make this work, right? So if he had gone to Microsoft in advance, and there are lots of different things that could have happened depending on the relationship. Like Microsoft could have ignored him, or they could have bought him, or they could have, run him to the ground in a different way, right? Like there are lots of different ways that could have turned out. But I think to the point that we've been talking about, partnerships are really important, and the right partnerships are really important to make these businesses a success, because you are going up against behemoths in a lot of different ways.
A question in the back?
Thank you all for your thoughts. They're very interesting. One of the things that is clear from this discussion is that it seems that the impediment to the circular economy that we have is the design of the manufacturer. Forever we've designed products to be disposable. They build them, sell them, and we dispose of them. So, it seems to me if we're going to break that model and come up with a new model, there has to be some incentive for the manufacturer to design in, and I think this is what you've been alluding to all evening, design in some way to recapture those products. So, there are different business models that I've heard about where, rather than sell the product, rather than selling you the raisin blade, they would rent you the raisin blade, but you would have to return it back to them so they can repurpose it. And I was just wondering if there are any, this kind of disruptive design that you're aware of that is in the manufacturing design area that is going to disrupt the whole business model. Because that's really, to make this happen, there has to be a business model to make it work.
So just to state the question again, so essentially manufacturers have been designing for an end of life. How do we make sure that they rethink that concept so that they're designing for the circular economy?
Well, I think we see examples in the street here. For example, you have these bicycles that you can rent now. You don't need to own them, and they're definitely built to last. We see them with cars as well. I know at least where I live, people less and less want to own cars because it's it's a pain to go to the mechanic, and they always break, and it's expensive, and you have to park it somewhere, and so there's these huge groups of cars now that are shared, and companies compete to sell to these big private companies that own these cars, and they compete by making sure they have a very long extended warranties, and so there's innovations in that business model more and more, and we've been working now with companies like Bosch, for example, that make power tools, and they find that at least in Europe, people don't have place to each have their own power tools, and they're starting to sell services around it. So they rent you the tools, and you have an app, and you say, okay, I need these power tools. It's in your mailbox the next day, and when you're finished, you send it back in the same box. So there's new business models that are being trialed, at least, and it's around the idea of sharing products instead of owning them.
And I think just adding on to that, you're seeing that in the apparel industry, probably most on the consumer end, everything from Rent the Runway to other kind of boxed and rental ways of filling up your closet.
Especially for designer clothes, right?
Yeah,
Which is what Rent the Runway is.
Right, Rent the Runway is specifically designer, but I think you're going to see more models out there that are for the rest of your wardrobe as well. So
one of the things that's so amazing about our internet economy now is the ease with which we can return things. So, the ability to use a product and then return it to where you bought it for some value, it would seem to be much more feasible now than it would have been.
yeah.
Yeah, that, and I think you can kind of tie into the Internet of Things as well, where as products are made that communicate back to the manufacturer and tell them how they're behaving, the manufacturer will know it's time to get this back, and they could even shoot an email to the consumer and say, your replacement will be there in 7 days. Please use the same box to send the old one back with. And then I was going to give a couple more examples of areas where manufacturers are doing this. Electric vehicle batteries. Oftentimes, the harnesses are reused from model to model. We harvest computer chips off certain boards and return it back to the manufacturer so they can use the same computer chip in the next board that they're manufacturing. I think one thing that manufacturers and everyone needs to recognize is that the circular economy is the growth economy. That by keeping that value, reusing those resources instead of going back to the earth to recover them. You have more ability on the other end, more money, more ability to develop new and different practices, to grow jobs, to whatever it may be. And I think that when manufacturers buy into that and start to make products that are made to be made again, they will reap those benefits.
And a couple comments from my work in the manufacturing industry. I had a conversation with Caterpillar, who makes large farm equipment, industrial equipment, and they started up a remanufacturing business. So basically, they found that a substantial portion of essentially the frame of the tractors could be reused after the first one died, essentially. And they found, first of all, that it was safer to remanufacture that tractor because there was almost no welding required, and welding's one of the places where a lot of the incidents occur, safety incidents. And then second, it was more profitable than their original equipment business. So I think for a lot of manufacturers, they can find that remanufacturing is more profitable. And then the second issue is one that David alluded to with the Internet of Things and connected products. We're finding that a lot of manufacturers are shifting their mindset from selling products to selling services. And maybe they sell the product like they sell the razor, and the services are the razor blade, essentially. But it's going to take a while for that full shift to happen. But I think they're starting to think that way, which is really interesting.
Well, I think what's also finally happening is that this idea of eco-design, which isn't happening in products that you're just selling once at all. It's a pity, but it hasn't happened. When you start to share these products and they have to be remanufactured and fixed, then the producer is starting to think, okay, I need to do that in the most efficient way because I don't want to invest any money in fixing it.
Right.
I want so many people to use the same. So when it comes, it's broken. I need the part to be easily dismantled and changed. And finally, through this sharing of things, we're starting to see some eco-design.
So if manufacturers are making money off the service, they make it easier to service, so they make more money on the service.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
exactly.
In a way, if I may just briefly, I think you've touched on a lot of elements that different business models in a circular economy, right? So redesign for recovery or ease of recovery. We've talked about shared equipment or shared space, any number of the shared use of a product or a enterprise. And then we've actually gotten into products as a service, which is a really important element of it. So there's a few different business models, and some of the more successful vertically integrated circular economy platforms use all of them, or use all those tools to really enhance or expand how many. It's almost like a ripple effect, if you will, on water, right? There's that first ring, and then there's multiple rings that come out of it. So there can be multiple circular economies off of one chain of events or occurring. To your points of, dissecting it gets a little messy in a panel. It probably lends itself more to slide, but I think you can see a lot of business models come out of that, and your question has prompted it, I guess.
So I think we're just about at the end. Are there any more questions?
There was
Didn't
one,
quite
this
caught.
gentleman here.
Oh, yes, sir. SpaceX. Do they?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They've actually realized gain because of that, because they don't have to spend so much to create new boosters every time they launch into space. But it also brought to mind what is happening in the aircraft industry. You have all these jets that are being produced, old jets being decommissioned. What happens to all those aircraft?
So the question was about what happens to the old aircraft, and I don't know a lot about this industry. Are you nodding your head because you do know?
No, but just by like any other product, you valorize everything you dismantled. If it's plastic, it is, and if it's titanium, it has high value, and all the electronics into it is an electronic product, which has to be recycled in most places in the world. So I think you as soon as you start to dismantle something, you're going to find value in all the parts, and it's not different if it's a boat or a plane or a computer or anything else.
And I will say for aircraft, they have a very long life, and some carriers will say, I'm only going to use my planes for this long, and they'll sell it to another company who will use it for another 10 or 15 years. So that's actually an example of where the product has a very long life, and they're highly motivated to try to keep that product living even longer.
Yeah. I think you're spot on with the reconditioning of it as one element. The other, though, is aluminum is one of eight materials in the global economy that's really, really resource intensive and therefore valuable to recover. So when they do hit an end of useful life, there's a lot of value in pulling aluminum. Mm-hmm. So I think you'll see, as fleet turnover continues, we've finally seen what may be the end of the 747 in commercial U.S. flight and use. A lot of them are being grabbed, as you said, and taken out of passenger flight and put to other purposes because they're remarkable planes. When those finally go, I think you'll see the aluminum go right back into the economy. It's a really high value resource.
So thank you very much, and thank you so much to our panel. You were great. Thank you.